Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is Kerry Chaput, and our conversation will be about, and I'm going to give this my best shot to pronounce, the Filles du Roi in French, or the King's Daughters in English. This was a group of about 800 women sent by the French crown to the colony of New France, which today is part of Canada, between 1663 and 1673. The purpose was to help populate the colony by marrying settlers and starting families. These women are sometimes referred to today as the Mothers of Canada. A little about Kerry before we start. She's an award winning author who is dedicated to writing about badass women in history. She also writes historical fiction and has published numerous books, including the Defying the Crown trilogy. Kerry, welcome. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. So, to get started, for some context, what was New France?
New France was the French colony that is located in, like you said, part of Canada. So back when they first colonized in 1534, it encompassed the area around Quebec and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Over the years, it did extend south all the way down to Louisiana, but at the time period we're talking about, it was purely in and around Quebec.
Got it. So then, how did the King's Daughters, and I'm going to use the English version, but how did the King's Daughters program come to be? And why then?
Yeah. So a little bit of background about what was happening at the time. So you have, everyone's colonizing lands at this time. Everyone's trying to compete for resources. And France, their explorers landed around 1534. And this was also at the time that the English were colonizing lands as well, mostly south of there. And France and England obviously were rivals. And in New France, what became New France, there was a very strong fur trade, especially beaver trade, and it was very lucrative for the king. And the King of France at the time, King Louis XIV, as most of us know, was extremely extravagant, right? He was building Versailles. He had lots of wars to fund. He had this very extravagant lifestyle. So he needed lots of money. And this beaver trade in Canada helped him do that. So it was very precious to him that he keep and build on this land. So even though it was colonized around 1534, it was about 100 years of that region kind of struggling. The population was growing kind of slowly. It really wasn't, there was a lot of trouble. Like the settlements that they tried to build either were attacked or fell apart. And there were a lot of Iroquois attacks. There was issues with the English. It was tough roads there for a while. I want to also kind of sidestep for a second, because when you talk about the colonizing of indigenous lands, it's really obviously such a complicated, sad time in history. One specific thing about New France that was a little bit different is that they didn't come in, kill off the Native Americans, and say, this is our land now. They took a more collaborative approach. They made friends with who were mostly the Huron, or Wyandots, is what they're mostly referred as, and the Algonquin. They were the natives that were in the region at the time. And they took a friendly approach with them and said, let's work together. You can help us. You can give us beaver pelts, and we will in turn protect you against your enemies, the Iroquois. And then also you've got the Iroquois, who were aligned with the English. So there's a lot of political interest happening around this time. So you can imagine then that the king is looking at this region saying, this is really important. We can't lose it to the English. But what's happening is we've kind of got a lot of men here and no women. And so the population was not growing. Not only were more men not really moving there, but many of them were leaving. They were going to other regions, going back to France. Some were marrying indigenous women and moving into their culture. So he's like, we need to find women. And for King Louis XIV, I guess he was progressive in his own way. He didn't just take women, send them, and say, have a new life. He decided to build a program. Well, I think it was actually his Minister of Finance who came up with this, but the king thought it was a great idea. He said, let's go find women in France who really don't have much other options. They really are not going to thrive here in France. Let's give them an opportunity to go and help populate New France, and we'll make a pretty sweet deal for them. And what they wanted was they want that message to get around to the other women of France that Canada is actually somewhere that you can thrive. So they built this program that was very enticing and ended up being 800 women, just shy of 800 women over a 10-year period that partook in this program.
Fascinating. Were other countries doing the same, or was this pretty novel for the time?
I had read about multiple programs that sent what they called marriageable women, but I don't know of any that were really giving dowries. Like the king was giving them dowries. They were giving them money. And there were pieces of this story that we can get into that were they fascinated me so much. I came across this story as I was researching my husband's French-Canadian ancestry. They knew that his family had been in Quebec for 300 years. And I asked his mother-in-law once, where in France did your family come from? And she said, I have no idea. So I set out to, find that answer for them. And as I'm researching, I came across the story of these group of women that were born in France and then married and had children and died mostly in Quebec and Montreal. And their stories just started jumping off the page. And I thought, this is too wild. I can't believe this actually happened. So for me, there might have been other programs, but I didn't really come across ones that had the extent of support that these women did.
Got it. Okay, so the program launches. How much demand is there from the women in France to join?
I think that there was a lot of reservation. The ages of these women were between 14 and 40, I think, maybe as high as 40. The average age was around 24. So we're mostly talking about young women, poor women. And they had to leave their family. They had to sign up and say, I'm never going to see my homeland again, never going to see my family again. I'm going to go across the world if I even make it, right? Across on the ship if I survive. Right. And I'm going to go to this brand new world with harsh winters and there's no infrastructure, nothing's built up. So I think it was a bit of a hard sell, to be quite truthful. But many of these women really were, they were destitute. They had no options. And so there was a little bit of, well, what else? What am I going to do here? I guess I'll try this. So I think it took a little while for it to take off.
And on that point around infrastructure, so how ready was society in New France to accept these women?
I find this very fascinating. Not much. There was not much over there. But in this very interesting way, because of that, these women helped build the society, which I think is very, very interesting. So originally when they started this program, they were mostly from the cities. It was La Rochelle, Rouen, and Paris were the primary places that this started as. And they were mostly women that some were orphans, a lot were orphans, but some were just the youngest of a very big family or a very poor family or, anyone that was struggling. And they just thought, well, I've got this interesting option out here in Canada. And when they were there, we'll get into more details about what made it really interesting. But once they were married, they had to build their farm. They had to build their house. They were given makings of a farm once they were married. So they had to be, the husband and the wife had to be very collaborative partners in building their life there. Yeah. And that is very different than the society that they left in France, right? And so there wasn't much infrastructure there. There wasn't much in preparation, but they were kind of adventurers in their own way.
So these women arrive. What was life like for them upon arriving in New France?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was kind of formal. They were greeted by kind of the new mayor, I believe, at the time. If they had a mayor at the time, that might not be the right term. Apologies. But whoever was sort of in charge at the time, they kind of greeted them and gave them this grand, welcome. And imagine you've got this settlement of hundreds of men and hardly any women. They were like, yeah, all right. Like they were welcomed because they these men were just like ready to leave, and so this gave them an opportunity to say, let's start something new here. And so they were very, for the most part, welcomed, taken care of. They part of the deal when they left France is that they were given a dowry, like a royal dowry from the king. They were given items that was put in a chest, so like shoes and stockings and bonnets and all of the requirements that were needed to make clothing. They were given all of these material things that they really didn't have in France on top of money, right? On top of paid passage. And they were under the protection of the king. And so all of this is very enticing if you are living in poverty in 17th century France, right? 17th century Paris, which was really, they were struggling, right? The poor were really struggling for food and money then. So it's pretty enticing. And then once you got to Canada, you live with the nuns. They had an abbey that was built there that could house them, at least the first group. I think the first group was about 100 women, maybe less. Over the time, they needed to build bigger facilities. But in the beginning, they stayed with the nuns at the abbey. So they're very protected, very safe. And then the thing about this story that really perked my ears up and I went, oh my gosh, this is amazing. The men were not choosing the women. They wanted the women to feel a sense of safety and have power and control, which is, again, not typical for 17th century anywhere. And so these women held what was the equivalent of 17th century speed dating. And they went to barns and these women lined up. It's wild, right? Yeah. And then the settlers they went in through a line and they just introduced themselves to all of these women, and the women asked them questions, and it was hilarious. Like, do you have a hunting license? And how many fireplaces do you have? It was very practical kind of, I need to start a practical life here. And the women decided they chose what settler they wanted to marry. And which alone is just kind of unheard of. I've not heard of anything like this, right? And the women chose the men. And then another step, which makes it kind of amazing, is that this is, again, approved by the king. They got married by a notary, like basically in the back of a church. It was just like a legal document. They didn't get married in the church until they really were certain that this person was right for them. So they got married by a notary. And the theory on that being that they could break their marriage contract if they were unhappy. So in a weird way, they had a divorce approved by the king.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
Okay. I know, right?
Yeah, I mean that is really incredible. You definitely, like you said, you don't really hear stories like that from that time period.
No.
So then going to the point you made earlier about development. So these women arrive, they get married. How do they influence the development of that region?
Well, they are building the infrastructure and they are building the farms, and they are having the babies, really. And part of the program was that they were given more money for every baby they had. So they had more of an incentive. But also, although it was a very harsh life, we're talking, anyone who knows about winters in that part of Canada, just extremely harsh winters, they did have to contend with Iroquois attacks. There were reports of wolf attacks. So everything was really pretty harsh there. But comparatively, when historians look at their life versus their counterparts' life that stayed in, let's say, Paris, they had longer lifespans. They had more children. They had more food there. There was a lower population, and there was tons of wildlife everywhere. And so there was access to things that they didn't have back home. So there was it was very tough, but they also had a pretty good quality of life. Also at the time, King Louis XIV made himself an absolute monarch. So he really he was the head of the Catholic Church. He was the head of the entire universe, according to him. So the entire colony of Quebec was under Catholic rule. Everything was done through the priest. And that was another requirement for these women. In order to be chosen, you had to be of a certain age, you had to be Catholic, and you had to have the priest give a notice of purity to be able to participate in this program, which is kind of, of course, pretty typical of the time. I'd expect that. But so they were completely entrenched in this Catholic society that was building from the ground up. So I think that their presence allowed enough population to grow and build actual settlements that became cities.
What did people think of the program at the time?
Um, in New France, they thought it was great. It was they were they were mostly respected, these women, and they were given a new chance, and they were um, I think they were mostly happy to be there. And back in France, I think that the men who were running this program were quite proud of themselves. They were like, "This is working. We're seeing a lot of women having babies, and we're seeing more people staying there and coming there." And they were actually sending more soldiers there in order to protect their allies who were Native Americans. So um, the Huron and the Algonquin, specifically Huron, but also Algonquin, they were actually protecting them with the military. So there was a pretty strong alliance. I think for the most part, people were generally like, okay, this seems to be like a good thing. However, there was this really big push to kind of outdo the English. So on that 100-year span where it was, kind of struggling for France, they were looking at their neighbors, the English, who had colonized, parts of New England and Virginia, and the English were much more successful. The population was booming. They had more money kind of invested. So everyone was in this kind of push to be bigger and richer. And I don't know, it's an interesting thing. So I think they saw this program as a way to get there.
Huh. But generally, the feedback from the women was that they did like the program. Like, it was maybe an oversimplified word, but it was positive for them as an experience.
I would say yes. There definitely were stories. So I actually looked this up because I couldn't remember the exact number, but so I looked it up. So out of 770 women, 737 of them married. It's a big number. And it should also be mentioned that these women were not in contract with the king. It's not like the king was like, you're going to go and you go pick a husband, and that's it. They were given incentives like the farm, like the money, but they did not have to marry. Some chose not to. Some stayed in the abbey and became nuns. Some returned to France. Some changed their mind before they even got on the boat and were like, no way, I can't do it. So there were women who just went, this is not for me, and kind of got scared. There were women who did end up thriving, who didn't get married. They were less so. But even the women who did get married, there are plenty of records of ones who separated and said, I'm not happy with this person. I want another one. They'd go back in the system and go find another husband and get another dowry.
And is it a fair phrase to say that then there was relative equality between men and women in the society there?
I would not go so far as to say that, because
Okay.
again, it was still a Catholic society, which very much had its rules, right, about men and women. But I would say when you take out the structure of the settlement and you look at just their lives I would say yes, because, pre-industrial revolution, husbands and wives were mostly sharing both farm work and housework. And that's a very different thing that happens, right? In 200 years later, is that then the men start working outside and the women start taking care of the house. But there was much more of I feel like, a vibe of equality in their homes.
So then, why does the program stop after 1673?
Because it was wildly successful.
Huh.
Yeah. So I think by the time they shut it down, I think they had like 800 babies in that 10 years, which is a lot of babies, right? Um, and it was also getting expensive. The amount of money that went to each of these women went up and down depending on how much money they had. So there were times that there were quite a bit of money that were handed to these women, and then there were other times that there weren't very much money, but they received maybe supplies that the king had in Canada. So it kind of went up and down. But after about 10 years, it was very successful. The population was booming, and they didn't really want to spend money on it anymore.
Got it. Is there a story from one of the women that stands out to you?
There is. So my trilogy that you mentioned, the Defying the Crown trilogy, is based on a fictionalized version of one of these women. So, Daughter of the King is the first in the series, and she's from La Rochelle, and she is actually a Protestant, and she has to convert to Catholicism to become part of this program. And so she's a kind of a mix of a couple of different women that I studied, and there were a few that did have to convert, which is also a whole nother fascinating kind of psychology. But there was one woman named Marguerite who was also in La Rochelle, and she kind of inspired a little bit of my character. What's fascinating about this one is when she became a fille du roi, she had a son from a husband had passed, and so it was her and her son. They allowed her to bring him as kind of part of the deal. They were like a package deal, and they found a settler who said, "Yes, great, I'll be his dad. Let's do this," which was pretty amazing for the time as well. So you'd think about most programs that would allow women to do these sort of things. They would want young and single and never been married and pure, right? That was one of the things, they had to be pure. And this one, they allowed her to bring her son. And I loved that. I think that was a really kind of progressive step.
In some ways, this whole story seems like it's out of the time.
I know it does. And actually, have you ever seen the show, Who Do You Think You Are?
I have not. No.
It's a really cool. It takes celebrities and it goes back and it finds their history. So for history nerds, it's pretty cool. But there was one. It was Tom Bergeron, and it was his ancestor. This was Marguerite, and I first kind of came in. I was like, oh wait, what's that story about? And I was really interested in her, and I started researching, and I ended up finding a bunch more of these women, especially in La Rochelle. But that one particular, I thought was really interesting.
I'll have to check out that show as well. Um, so, what has been the legacy of these women?
As you said, they are known as like the mothers of Canada, right? They're a source of pride, which I think is really neat. That many cultures um, erase women's contributions, which is why I have an entire platform about badass women in history. Because I want to talk about the things that women did that contributed to society, contributed to future. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that these women, these 770 women, helped. They completely helped shape North America and its future. And it is. They say that if you are of French Canadian descent, you are almost guaranteed to be descended from one or several of these women. So for French Canadians, it's their story of who they are and their ancestors.
Wow. Wow. Um, and so I guess then, taking that historian's lens, what is a lesson that can be taken from this program or from this society?
How important it is to empower women. I think that so much of history has been spent keeping women submissive, and controlling them when they step out of line, and feeling the need to keep them in a submissive place where there's a dominant figure, whether it's a husband or a father or whatever. Um, and this particular story shows how much of a community can be built when women are not just given agency over their own life, but encouraged to take control. And they did. They took control of their lives, of their families' lives, of their future, and they felt safe. I think that's a really big, important piece. When you create a situation in society where women feel safe, they thrive, because so much of women's stories is violent, and they're in constant fear and fight to try to stay safe and keep their family safe. And this is a scenario where they were given a little bit of a respite from that life, and they thrived because of it. Like I said, they had longer lifespans than their counterparts. They had probably better health than their counterparts because they weren't in constant fight or flight. I think that's really a lesson for the ages, and something that we could still adapt to this day, is creating a safe environment for women to be able to thrive.
That is a really important lesson. So, Kerry, is there anything that you feel we didn't talk about, but we should discuss regarding this program?
Oh, yes. Actually, there was a rumor that kind of went around back in the time, and it still persists to today. Some people still remember the Filles du Roi as prostitutes that were sent off and shunned because of their questionable moral fiber, if you will. And it could not be farther from the truth. As we talked about it, they had to have a letter of purity from their priest. So that is something that is, of course, women's history. This is what happens. You take women who actually had a little bit of power, and we flip the narrative to make it seem that they were wrong, that they did something, deviant, and that's why they were there, and it wasn't it at all. So we've really flipped the script. So I would say anyone who's heard that rumor about them being prostitutes, just know that that is 100% a rumor. It's completely wrong, and it really is wild to me how a rumor that started in 1660 or whatever still persists today, hundreds of years. And this is also something I talk about on my Substack a lot, is looking at history from a lens of nuance and understanding how much we were given that is propaganda, and really digging down to get the real truth of who people are.
Thank you for bringing that clarification, and in general, thank you for this conversation. This has been super fascinating, and a topic I think a lot of people don't know about, and seems like they really should. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love this story. And when I went through the genealogy records for my husband, I found that he was descendant from 33 of these women.
Wow.
And so, if anyone listening is French Canadian, I urge you to go start the search. The records, because they were through the Catholic Church, are impeccable. They're very easy to follow. And maybe you're descendant from one of these women as well.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thanks again, Kerry. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to Historical Snapshots wherever you listened to this podcast, and subscribe to us on Substack for more podcasts, snapshots, and long form stories.